So there is a very strange situation going on right now with the 3DS and a handful of games, and many of you have sent me this story throughout the last week or so, over and over and over again, and I wanted to look into it more to see if I could come up with anything here, and I figured today, over the weekend, we would take a look at this. Guys, if you enjoyed these videos, make sure that like button helps out a ton, and if new here to the Spawn Wave channel, make sure you subscribe down below. So first, let's talk about what exactly is happening, and this is the article that was making the rounds, and a lot of people were sending to me, talking about the 3DS and a couple of games that have just stopped working, seemingly at random. Like, there's no real reason for these games to just stop working, considering some of these are in collections where they're very well taken care of. So let's say you have Omega Ruby or Alpha Sapphire, and you've left it on your shelf for a while, you haven't touched it in a couple of years or something, and then you go over, you take it off the shelf, you pop it in your 3DS, and it's not being found by your system. Essentially, you pop it in, and just nothing pops up on the main screen, where normally, of course, the cartridge icon would pop up, you would select it, and then off you go. Well, it appears that for some reason, Alpha Sapphire and Omega Ruby are two games that are being pointed out by many, many people online. At first, it seemed that it was really an issue that was popping up in different European countries, but it appears that basically people all around the world now are saying they're having issues with this, and it was popping up on places like Reddit, where tons of comments were coming together talking about this. It also was popping up on places like Reset Era, where they were going back and forth in a thread basically testing these games. So like, they were like, oh, well, let me go off and check out my copy of Ruby or Sapphire, which you should do the same, and let me know down in the comments if your copy has just randomly stopped working. Now, some of these still work. Like, some people are just like, yeah, it's fine, and then they just put it back. Others are saying, wait a minute, no, it's not working. What is going on here? And there are a couple theories around this, and the other game that appears to have an issue is Persona Q. So if you have right now Ruby, Sapphire, or Persona Q for your 3DS, and you haven't touched it in a while, go grab it off the shelf, pop it into one of your 3DS systems, and see if it works. And the interesting thing about this is these games all came out around the same time in, like, North America. Persona Q and Ruby and Sapphire came out, like, right at the end of November, within a week of each other. I know Persona Q came out, like, 5 months earlier in Japan, but everyone's kind of pointing to the worldwide release of Alpha Sapphire, Omega Ruby, and then Persona Q going to other countries outside of Japan as maybe being a bad batch of chips. That's right, we're kind of going down to the hardware side of things. And so let's take a look at what exactly is inside of a 3DS cartridge, because I decided during the course of the week I would pop one of these open so I could kind of show you what's going on inside of a 3DS cartridge. This is one that I went ahead and kicked open, and the pins up here, it's the same format as the DS, and that, I mean, that's makes sense considering you can pop a DS game into your 3DS and it works fine. Really, the only thing that stops it from going into your older DS system is the plastic, where they have like a little tab on the one side to keep it from legitimately just like fitting in. Kind of like what Nintendo did with the Super Nintendo at one point when it came to region locking, or the Nintendo 64, right? Is they would just have plastic that basically gets in the way. So it's pretty obvious where the game probably is to you right now, and that's this big main chip in the middle here. Occasionally you'll have a couple of extra tiny little components here, little fuses and whatnot, and then you might even have a chip up here, but sometimes, from what I've seen, it's almost legitimately just this chip in the middle here. On the back, there's like nothing. You just see some of the circuitry and traces that are running around, and then we have like the little Nintendo logo here, but this is a pretty standard TSOP chip, and that's just a surface-mounted chip that has several pins. They come in a bunch of different packages. It's like 32-pin, 40, 48-pin, and we would use kind of this form factor a while ago for like Super Nintendo reproduction carts. If a game got over, I think, a megabyte, we would usually look to use these kinds of chips along with like little boards that would allow it to kind of match up pin for pin with a Super Nintendo cartridge board. And so Nintendo used this. I know they have like Macronix is generally used by Nintendo, but then you'll get kind of these chips that are just like blank sort of. And the idea here is it's of course cheaper and can go into a smaller form factor like these cartridges while still holding a pretty good size like game. I mean, I know generally with 3DS, hundreds of megabytes, gigabytes even of space have to go into these little like cartridges. So they decided to go with like kind of this flash memory. So there are some that are concerned that the flash memory, specifically this big chip in the middle here, is just going bad. And it could be from as people are wondering, a bad batch of chips that just happened to be used during the production of Alpha Sapphire and Omega Ruby, along with Persona Q, which was right there, probably on the production line, since they all came out within a week of each other. Now, there was some testing going on. I noticed that Sarah B posted up here on Reset Era that they had tried a copy of one of the Pokemon games in a 3DS console that had not been updated, and it worked fine, but they put it into a 3DS that had its firmware updated and it didn't work. And that could be, as they say, something with the firmware, a firmware issue, but there's also a chance that Nintendo had updated security checks or checksums or any of this stuff, things that would keep the game from being found by the system and then allowing it to essentially post and start up, because we could have a problem with some of the address lines or just the integrity of the pins overall. I mean, you can see how many pins are here, and generally when it goes through the factory, the way that they make this work is they have all these traces kind of lined up, and they have like a paste solder underneath, so that it goes through an oven, essentially, melts all of it, and then it comes out the other side ready to be packaged in the plastic. That way they can get it through a lot faster, rather than have to go through by hand and solder each and every pin. It just makes it a lot quicker, and you can have like machines do it pretty easily as it goes through. So there was a really good video that was posted up by Voltar where he decided to take a look at, I believe, a copy of Persona Q, or no, it was a copy of Omega Ruby that he had picked up on eBay that wasn't posting or working or any of that, and he reflowed the chip. Basically, hey, I'm going to take this soldering iron and I'm going to run a small bead of solder with some no clean flux all along these pins here to try to just patch them up, essentially. Like, one of these pins could be bad or just coming dislodged and not have a good connection, which we consider like a dirty connection. And at that time, it might not be found by the system. So he went through, he did that. It's an unlisted video now, but it worked. Like, it fixed it. The idea of having to reflow these different cartridges isn't necessarily new. I've had to do that with Game Boy games, believe it or not. There was a Pokemon Yellow I had to fix that needed a reflow on one of the main chips. There was also a copy of The Legend of Zelda on the Game Boy, I believe Link's Awakening, and there was a smaller chip on there that needed to be reflowed, and it fixed it. So these surface mount chips have had issues in the past, and this could just be the latest iteration of that. So there is a chance that through firmware updates, the ability for security checks to happen may have been heightened, and maybe one of the address lines, if it's not 100% there with the correct integrity, it then trips something, and at that point the cartridge does not boot. So as Voltar goes around and just essentially resolders all the pins, so if there is one that's bad, it was probably covered. At that time, he managed to fix Omega Ruby, and it's not something that most people are going to do at home because these are tiny little pins. I mean, if I zoom in here, these are very small pins. I mean, this is one of the this is one of the connections here that you can flip over and take a look on your own 3DS game, and then you can see how much smaller one of these pins are compared to it. It's usually something you would go and solder and then go back with a magnifying glass to see if any of them are bridged, and then even a bit further, it can bridge kind of back here, and it's a whole thing to the point where sometimes if you messed one of these up, you would have to remove this chip completely, clean it, and then put it back down. And you might be wondering, well, how can that happen exactly? How could one of these pins become dislodged from one of these solder pads? Well, I mean, there's a couple things. If it is a bad batch that came from the factory, maybe it wasn't put together correctly along with some of these Ruby and Sapphire cartridges that were released worldwide at the time alongside of Persona Q. And it can also be from just overall use of the cartridge. I mean, let's face it, these different handheld systems, when they have cartridges, they're not always handled with care, especially if you bought it used. You don't know what happened before that, and popping it in and out of the system is, I mean, on its own, kind of a violent affair if you think about it, because you're jamming the cartridge in, you're pressing down, popping it back out, and ripping it out. And if you look inside of the plastic, there's not a lot of support for this board, and you can flex it pretty easily. So there is a chance that just overall handling of the cartridge could be shocking and maybe even bending and flexing the board enough to where if there isn't a great connection initially from the factory for these pins, that it could actually break and become a dirty connection. So I guess the one good piece of news right now is that it's mostly tied to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire and Persona Q, which, I mean, those on their own are going to end up probably being games that are more valuable than the vast majority of 3DS games, years down the line, but it doesn't appear to be a widespread issue yet. And I say yet because there is a possibility that this does get a bit larger as we go along and these cartridges get older. And yeah, I mean, flash memory does have technically a shelf life. It could be 20, 30 years, but that does exist. And we all assume that Nintendo is going to shut down the 3DS store someday. So if you don't have access to these games digitally, and then you have some sort of lifespan on these physical copies with the flash memory, yeah, you start to run into really a preservation issue at that time. And if we have certain games that just weren't even built well enough from the factory, that could get out of hand pretty quick. So it's something to keep an eye on, but we're going to need more data and information to continue to come out here. I don't know how many people are still running around testing their copies of Sapphire, Ruby, or Persona Q, but I would suggest you do that, and let me know in the comments if that is something you're all of a sudden becoming aware of, that this game is not working and I haven't really been playing it much recently and I take good care of it. So if that's the case, it could end up being even more of a widespread issue than was originally assumed for Ruby, Sapphire, and Persona Q. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.